The Anglo-Saxons were a people who inhabited Great Britain from the 5th century. They comprised people from Germanic tribes who migrated to the island from continental Europe, the descendants, and indigenous British groups who adopted some aspects of Anglo-Saxon culture and language. The Anglo-Saxon period denotes the period of British history between about 450 and 1066, after their initial settlement, and up until the Norman conquest. The Anglo-Saxon period includes creation of an English nation, with many of the aspects that survive today including regional government of shires and hundreds, the re-establishment of Christianity, a flowering in literature and language, and the establishment of charters and law. The term Anglo-Saxon is also popularly used for the language, in scholarly use more usually called Old English, that was spoken and written by the Anglo-Saxons in England and eastern Scotland between at least the mid-5th century and the mid-12th century. The history of the Anglo-Saxons is the history of a cultural identity, and how this developed from divergent groups, grew with the adoption of Christianity, was used in the establishment of various kingdoms, and, in the face of a threat from Danish settlers, re-established itself as one identity until after the Norman conquest. The outward appearance of Anglo-Saxon culture can be seen in the material culture of buildings, dress styles, illuminated texts and grave goods. Behind the symbolic nature of these cultural emblems there are strong elements of tribal and lordship ties, and an elite that became kings who developed burst, and saw themselves and the people in biblical terms. Above all, as Helena Hamerow has observed, local and extended kin groups remained the essential unit of production throughout the Anglo-Saxon period. The effects persist even in the 21st century, as according to a study published in March 2015, the genetic makeup of British populations today shows traces of the political units in the early Anglo-Saxon period. Use of the term Anglo-Saxon assumes that the words Angles, Saxons or Anglo-Saxon have the same meaning in all the sources. Assigning ethnic labels such as Anglo-Saxon is fraught with difficulties, and the term itself only began to be used in the 8th century to distinguish Germanic groups in Britain from those on the continent. Catherine Hill summarized the views of many modern scholars that attitudes towards Anglo-Saxons and hence the interpretation of their culture and history have been more contingent on contemporary political and religious theology as on any kind of evidence. Ethnonym. The Old English ethnonym, Anglo-Saxon, comes from the Latin Angli-Saxones and became the name of the peoples Bede calls Anglorum and Gildas calls Saxones. Anglo-Saxon is a term that was rarely used by Anglo-Saxons themselves. It is not an endonym. Also, the use of Anglo-Saxon disguises the extent to which people thought of themselves as Anglo-Scandinavian after the Viking Age or the conquest of 1016, or Anglo-Norman after the Norman conquest. The earliest historical references from outside Britain refer to piratical Germanic raiders, Saxones, who attacked the shore of Britain and Gaul in the 3rd century AD. Procopius states that Britain was settled by 3 races, the Angeloi, Frisonus, and Britons. The term Angli-Saxones seems to have first been used in continental writing of the 8th century. Paul the Deacon uses it to distinguish the English Saxons from the continental Saxons. The name therefore seemed to mean English Saxons. The Christian Church seems to have used the word Angli, for example in the story of Pope Gregory I and his remark, non Angli sed Angeli. The terms Aranlisk and Angelson were also used by West Saxon King Alfred to refer to the people, and in doing so he was following established practice. The first use of the Anglo-Saxon amongst the insular sources are in the titles for Athelstan, Angel Saxonum Denorum K Glorious Assimus Rex and Rex Anglo-Saxondarum Northumbria Imperator Paganorum Gubernator Britannorum K Propugnator. Interesting, at other times he uses the term Rex Anglorum, which presumably meant both Anglo-Saxons and Danes. The term Anglo-Saxon is used by Ethelred, and it is only with King Cnut in 1021 that land, not the people, are referred to, Eola Inglalandes, Sinning. These titles provide a sense that the Anglo-Saxons were a Christian people with a king anointed by God. The indigenous Common Brittonic speakers referred to Anglo-Saxons as Saxonies or possibly Sason. The equivalent word in Scottish Gaelic is Sassenach, and in the Irish language, Sassanach. Catherine Hills suggests that it is no accident that the English call themselves by the name sanctified by the Church, as that of a people chosen by God, whereas their enemies use the name originally applied to piratical raiders. Early Anglo-Saxon history. The early Anglo-Saxon period covers the history of medieval Britain that starts from the end of Roman rule. It is a period widely known in European history as the Migration period, also the Volkerwanderung, and was a period of intensified human migration in Europe from about 400 to 800. The migrants were Germanic tribes such as the Goths, Vandals, Angles, Saxons, Lombards, Suebi, Frisi and Franks. They were later pushed westwards by the Huns, Avars, Slavs, Bulgars and Alans. By the year 400, southern Britain, that is Britain below Hadrian's Wall, was a peripheral part of the Roman Empire in the west, occasionally lost to rebellion or invasion, but until then always eventually recovered. Eventually around 410, Britain slipped beyond direct imperial control into a phase which has generally been termed sub-Roman migration. The traditional narrative of this period is one of decline and fall, invasion and migration. However, Heinrich Harke states, "It is now widely accepted that the Anglo-Saxons were not just transplanted Germanic invaders and settlers from the continent, but the outcome of insular interactions and changes." Writing c. 540, Gildas mentions that, sometime in the 5th century, a council of leaders in Britain agreed that some land in the east of southern Britain would be given to the Saxons on the basis of a treaty, a foedis, by which the Saxons would defend the Britons against attacks from the Picts and Scots in exchange for food supplies. The most contemporaneous textual evidence is the Chronica Gallica of 452, which records for the year 441. The British provinces, which to this time had suffered various defeats and misfortunes, are reduced to Saxon rule. This is an earlier date than that of 451 for the coming of the Saxons, used by Bede in his Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, written around 731. Gildas recounts how war broke out between the Saxons and the local population. Higham calls it the War of the Saxon Federates, which ended shortly after the siege at Mons Badonicassa. The Saxons go back to their eastern home. Gildas calls the peace a grievous divorce with the barbarians. The price of peace, Nick Higham argues, is a better treaty for the Saxons, giving them the ability to receive tribute from people across the lowlands of Britain. The archaeological evidence agrees with this earlier timescale. In particular, the work of Catherine Hills and Sam Lucy on the evidence of Spong Hill has moved the chronology for the settlement earlier than 450, with a significant number of items now in phases before Bede's date. This vision of the Anglo-Saxons exercising extensive political and military power at an early date remains contested. The most developed vision of a continuation in sub-Roman Britain, with control over its own political and military destiny for well over a century, is that of Kenneth Dark, who suggests that the sub-Roman elite survived in culture, politics, and military power up to c. 570. However, Nick Higham seems to agree with Bede, who identified three phases of settlement: an exploration phase, when mercenaries came to protect the resident population; a migration phase, which was substantial as implied by the statement that Anglis was deserted; and an establishment phase, in which Anglo-Saxons started to control areas, implied in Bede's statement about the origins of the tribes. There remain variant views over how many migrants came to Britain in this period. Heinrich Hark suggests that the figure is around 100,000, based on the molecular evidence, whereas archaeologists such as Christine Hills and Richard Hodges suggest the number is nearer 20,000. By around 500, the Anglo-Saxon migrants were established in southern and eastern Britain. What happened to the indigenous Brittonic people is also subject to question. Heinrich Hark and Richard Coates point out that they are invisible archaeologically and linguistically. However, taking a fairly high Anglo-Saxon figure and a low Brythonic one, Brythonic people are likely to have outnumbered Anglo-Saxons by at least 4 to 1. The interpretation of such figures is that while, culturally, the later Anglo-Saxons and English did emerge as remarkably un-British, their genetic, biological makeup is none the less likely to have been substantially, indeed, predominantly, British. The process of Anglo-Saxonization is described by two processes. One is similar to cultural changes observed in Russia, North Africa and parts of the Islamic world, where a powerful minority culture becomes, over a rather short period, adopted by a settled majority. The second process is explained through incentives. Nick Hyam has provided this summary. As Bede later implied, language was a key indicator of ethnicity in early England. In circumstances where freedom at law, acceptance with the kindred, access to patronage, and the use and possession of weapons were all exclusive to those who could claim Germanic descent, then speaking Old English without Latin or Brittonic inflection had considerable value. By the middle of the 6th century, some Brythonic people in the lowlands of Britain had moved across the sea to form Brittany. Some had moved west, but the majority were abandoning their past language and culture and adopting the new culture of the Anglo-Saxons. As they adopted language and culture, so the barriers that existed between peoples, who had lived parallel lives, started to break down. The archaeological evidence shows a lot of continuity in the system of landscape and local governance, which was inherited from the indigenous community, and there is evidence for a fusion of culture in this early period. One of the elements is the Brythonic names that appear in the lists of Anglo-Saxon elite. The Wessex royal line was traditionally founded by a man named Cerdic, an undoubtedly Celtic name ultimately derived from Caraticus. This may indicate that Cerdic was a native Briton, and that his dynasty became anglicized over time. A number of Cerdic's alleged descendants also possessed Celtic names, including the Bretwalda, Ceorlin, the last occurrence of a British name in this dynasty being that of King Cadwalla, who died as late as 689. Development of an Anglo-Saxon society in the last half of the 6th century. 4 structures were having a bearing on the development of society. They were the position and freedoms of the CEORL, the smaller tribal areas coalescing into larger kingdoms, the elite developing from warriors to kings, and Irish monasticism developing under Finian and his pupil Columba. The Anglo-Saxon farms of this period are often falsely supposed to be peasant farms. However, a CEORL, who was the lowest-ranking freeman in early Anglo-Saxon society, was not a peasant but an arms-owning male with the support of a kindred, access to law and the Were Guild, situated at the apex of an extended household working at least one hide of land. The farmer had freedom and rights over lands, with provision of a rent or duty to an overlord who provided only slight lordly input. Most of this land was common outfield arable land that provided the ability to build kinship and group cultural ties. The tribal hidage lists 35 peoples, or tribes, with assessments in hides, which may have originally been defined as the area of land sufficient to maintain one family. The assessments in the hidage reflect the relative size of the provinces. Although varying in size, all 35 peoples of the tribal hidage were of the same status, in that they were areas which were ruled by their own elite family, and so were assessed independently for payment of tribute. By the end of the 6th century, larger kingdoms were based on the south or east coasts. They include the provinces of the Jutes of Hampshire and Wight, the South Saxons, Kent, the East Saxons, East Angles, Lindsey and Dereer and Bernicia. Several of these kingdoms may have had as their initial focus a territory based on a former Roman civitas. By the end of the 6th century, the leaders of these communities were styling themselves kings, though it should not be assumed that all of them were Germanic in origin. The Bretwalda concept is taken as evidence for a presence of a number of early Anglo-Saxon elite families. What Bede seems to imply in his Bretwalda is the ability to extract tribute, overawe and/or protect the small regions, which may well have been relatively short-lived in any one instance. Ostensibly, Anglo-Saxon dynasties variously replaced one another in this role in a discontinuous but influential and potent roll call of warrior elites. Importantly, whatever their origin or whenever they flourished, they established their claim to lordship through their links to extended kin ties. As Helen Peake jokingly points out, they all just happen to be related back to Woden. The process from warrior to sinning, Old English for king, is described in Beowulf. Conversion to Christianity in 565. Columba, a monk from Ireland, who studied at the monastic school of Moville under Street Finian, arrived in Iona as a self-imposed exile. The influence of the monastery of Iona would grow into what Peter Brown has called an unusually extensive spiritual empire, which stretched from western Scotland deep to the southwest into the heart of Ireland, and to the southeast, it reached down throughout northern Britain, through the influence of its sister monastery Lindisfarne. In June 597 Columba died. As a quirk of history, at the same time Augustine landed on the Isle of Thanet and proceeded to King Ethelbert's main town of Canterbury. He had been the prior of a monastery in Rome when Pope Gregory the Great chose him in 595 to lead the Gregorian mission to Britain to Christianize the Kingdom of Kent from their native Anglo-Saxon paganism. Kent was probably chosen because Ethelbert had married a Christian princess, Bertha, daughter of Charibert I, the King of Paris, who was expected to exert some influence over her husband. Ethelbert was converted to Christianity, churches were established, and wider-scale conversion to Christianity began in the kingdom. Ethelbert's law for Kent, the earliest written code in any Germanic language, instituted a complex system of fines. Kent was rich with strong trade ties to the continent, and Ethelbert may have instituted royal control over trade. For the first time following the Anglo-Saxon invasion, coins began circulating in Kent during his reign. In 635 Aidan, an Irish monk from Iona, chose the Isle of Lindisfarne to establish a monastery and close to King Oswald's main fortress of Bamborough. He had been at the monastery in Iona when Oswald asked to be sent a mission to Christianize the kingdom of Northumbria from their native Anglo-Saxon paganism. Oswald had probably chosen Iona because after his father had been killed he had fled into southwest Scotland and had encountered Christianity, and had returned determined to make Northumbria Christian. Aidan achieved great success in spreading the Christian faith, and since Aidan could not speak English and Oswald had learned Irish during his exile, Oswald acted as Aidan's interpreter when the latter was preaching. Later, Northumberland's patron saint, Saint Cuthbert, was an abbot of the monastery, and then Bishop of Lindisfarne. An anonymous life of Cuthbert written at Lindisfarne is the oldest extant piece of English historical writing, and in his memory a gospel was placed in his coffin. The decorated leather book binding is the oldest intact European binding. In 664, the Synod of Whitby was convened and established Roman practice as the norm in Northumbria, and thus brought the Northumbrian Church into the mainstream of Roman culture. The episcopal seat of Northumbria was transferred from Lindisfarne to York. Wilfrid, chief advocate for the Roman position, later became Bishop of Northumbria, while Colman and the Ionan supporters, who did not change their practices, withdrew to Iona.